Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Aiko Schaefer, Executive Director of Just Solutions. In today's episode, we will explore the HEAL Act, a Washington state model policy that aims to address environmental justice and help facilitate a just transition. I'm joined today by Guillermo Rogel Jr., Legislative Advocate, and Deric Gruen, Co-Executive Director of Programs and Policy at Front and Centered. Front and Centered is a diverse and powerful coalition of communities of color-led groups across Washington state, whose mission and work come together at the intersection of equity, environmental, and climate justice. Welcome, Guillermo and Deric, to the Just Solutions podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Michael.
Well, it's so great to have you both on our podcast today. I miss working with you all. It's been great to see all the accomplishments coming out of Washington state and leadership that you bring to the broader climate movement, and excited to be able to dig in deep to get the latest on what's happening with the HEAL Act. The state legislative session has just ended. Are you guys relaxing, hanging out? What's going on?
I was definitely able to take some time off. I think legislators, lobbyists, community advocates alike all need a little bit of time right after session ends to regather themselves, connect with community, and then also, I think, just go back and see what the real world is like outside of the really stressful 105 days that we go through.
How is it feeling right now working in state legislatures? I mean, do you feel that they are more with the program on environmental justice? Is there a broader conversation that you've been seeing as time goes by?
The rhetoric has definitely increased substantially in the past, 3 or 4 years. Environmental justice didn't even get a mention, for example, in state law prior to a couple of years ago, and now it's in at least 10 chapters of state law.
I think that's something as exciting as it is to hear a lot of legislators, state agencies, and the executive use words like environmental justice. Not so much just transition. I think that's taking a little bit of time to get into everyone's rhetoric, but I think we want to make sure that we're matching all of these definitions with the right amount of action from the state as well.
For sure. I think it's been really remarkable to see the conversation shift, and the ongoing work is to make sure that those things actually have meaning, have impact. And that's going to be a lot of our conversation today. But you can't help but also notice that the climate conversation has changed. In Washington state, I think the environmentalists had worked for decades to really move climate policy, haven't been as successful as was needed. And I think really the introduction of communities and BIPOC frontline communities into the climate movement, which Front and Centered played an essential role in making that happen, I think has also propelled the broader climate conversation in Washington state.
Yeah, I think all really significant climate-related laws in the last 15 years have happened just since 2019, when we did see this change, in the movement nationally and also, in Washington state, to focus in the breadth of who's affected by climate, who has a role in decision-making, what climate policy should be solving for, to focus on the communities most impacted. So I think it has brought momentum to the climate policy work and legislative change.
Yeah, and I really think that although the 2019 ballot measure, in which Front and Center played a pivotal role in, while the measure did not pass, clearly the industry felt threatened enough to break records to spend against that effort. But the impact that it had was significant in terms of changing the conversation, bringing in different leaders into the movement, and subsequently putting a lot more focus and attention and conversation around how to really address climate change fundamentally. And so it's an interesting recognition of the leadership and work that Front and Centered has brought to Washington state, but also the leadership that you bring nationally and the different model ideas and innovations that you all are bringing. I'm so excited to dig into this interview with you today around the HEAL Act specifically, and to be able to share your experience and knowledge with our listeners. Today, we're talking about the Healthy Environment for All Act, the HEAL Act, a landmark environmental justice policy in Washington state passed in 2021. So why don't we start off by learning a little bit more about the HEAL Act? How does it address environmental and climate justice?
So I think the Healthy Environment for All Act addresses it in a few ways. It really sits at the intersection of racial and social justice and co-governance, and taking those values and those elements and turning them into state law. Because I think at this point, community members, lawmakers alike, have realized that we can't just tackle the climate crisis and expect us to meet our reduction in carbon emission goals without really centering equity. Environmental justice has been a part of the conversation in Washington state for a couple of decades, but it really hasn't been taken seriously until the last few years with this HEAL Act actually passing. So for us, it's really making sure that a community-led solution that includes elements of defining environmental justice and actually having state agencies listen to community recommendations sits at the core of this law. And we're hoping that by passing this, state agencies, the executive and the legislature in its total, are really having a firmer understanding of what it means to have community-led solutions drive really our mission to help meet our goals to reduce carbon emissions in the communities that need it the most. Because I think each state across the country is trying to reach those goals. And maybe on average, we are able to see healthier communities. But we know from all of the community sessions that we do, the research that we're able to put together as front and centered, that there are communities that are facing the effects of climate change in a much more drastic fashion than communities that might be more well off, have access to more resources, are less diverse. So we just want to make sure that this law is going to be sitting at the center of the climate crisis conversation here in Washington State.
When we think about the policy design, what are some of the key components that you think are essential if our listeners are interested in replicating this model?
The policy structure is really about like how do we harness and really take ownership of our state government to drive it to achieve environmental justice and climate justice outcomes within the kind of state infrastructure that exists. It requires of the initial tier of agencies most involved in environmental questions, it requires them to develop community engagement plans, to develop implementation plans for environmental justice that address all of their agency activities through an environmental justice lens. It requires them to develop budgets and meet funding goals for the percentage of funding dedicated to overburdened communities or frontline communities. It requires them to do environmental justice assessments of what's called significant agency actions, which include new policy development, major rulemakings, capital projects over a certain dollar threshold, grants and funding programs. So those will need to go through these environmental justice assessments. And then also requires creating more transparency and a dashboard of reporting progress on environmental justice among these agencies. So those are kind of the core requirements, in harnessing agencies' power towards the direction of environmental justice.
We know that community governance, co-governance is a huge aspect of environmental justice. And this is bringing in community members into spaces that have historically excluded community input. And the state legislature is already one way that is difficult for community members to actually get involved in the policymaking process. So we recognize that our advocacy as front and centered is geared towards the state legislature, but we also know that there are dozens of state agencies, whether that be Department of Transportation, Health, Ecology, all of them make decisions that impact the health of our community members. And so what we saw as critical to this bill was creating a community-centered governance structure that would actively be giving recommendations to, I believe it's about 10 state agencies here in Washington State that have the most effect on communities' health. This community group that is made up of practitioners, at-large community members, youth representatives, they all would be giving recommendations to these state agencies about their budgeting, about their significant agency action, and upcoming in a few weeks is how are they assessing the environmental justice impacts of all of their projects. We know that if there is a specific transportation project getting built in a community that is already facing health disparities, it is probably going to add to the health disparities that already exist. And for us, those kinds of projects shouldn't be able to continue. And that could be true for projects that are being done by the Department of Ecology, Health, or maybe future projects that the state legislature is considering. So on top of this, as I mentioned earlier, was a singular definition for environmental justice. So as we are tackling the next upcoming legislative sessions, we are all on the same page of what environmental justice means on paper, but we don't want the definition to just be included in different policies without some sort of accountability, which is what we're hoping this community council is helping us propel, is more accountability and transparency in the process.
Well, it's such a great model for environmental justice, and it's such a great model just for democracy. What you all have put in place is policy that makes our government work better for people and to really be able to shift their attention to communities that are more at risk. which is sort of counter at times in other policy designs where it's very much geared towards incentives and benefits for corporations or benefits for people who are economically well off. And I think that's a really important part of the work that you're doing. And looking at how you landed on the HEAL Act and the work that it took to get it passed, can you talk a little bit about the sort of efforts and things that you did to really build the engagement, the capacity, the legislative attention to really be able to pass the HEAL Act?
Sure. Yeah. So the HEAL Act, the ultimate goal is around reducing environmental health disparities in our state. And it really started, I think, with the formation of Front and Centered as a coalition of communities of color focused on racial justice issues, economic justice, some specifically on environmental justice. They were key stakeholders and had an important role to play to ensure that climate policy being developed did not exacerbate existing disparities and ideally was harnessed as a tool to reduce racial and environmental injustices. So from that coalition's perspective, we really needed to know a lot more about what are the environmental health disparities we're facing in our state. And we worked, primarily in the coalition of Front and Centered on statewide policy focused on climate. Had looked to our neighbors and learned from places like California, who had developed tools like CalEnviroscreen, had been effective in leveraging those tools in policy to help ensure and create an accountability mechanism that investments were distributed more equitably than they had been historically. So Front and Centered led, a team with the state government, academics, and the University of Washington to develop an environmental health disparities map specifically for Washington State that would help reveal kind of which communities are really facing the greatest environmental health risks based, not only on environmental exposures, but also, social and health determinants. And we were able to leverage that tool to start to experiment in things like different rulemakings that were happening, grant funds to encourage agencies to use, that mapping tool to help prioritize investments. And that really, I think, was the seed of the HEAL Act and looking at the potential to expand those pilot projects from a decision on a small grant fund to really all of state government. And that we could leverage this tool and this idea of reducing environmental health disparities across all agencies involved in environmental work, so that every action the state's taking for the environment really also needs to address environmental health and environmental justice.
Deric, I think your foresight to think about the mapping tool and the state having that was really important part of the genesis of shifting the conversation. And then subsequently, I think your brainchild, Deric, of the HEAL Act and the construct in which we take the mapping tool into policy setting was what was essential, right? I mean, it's one thing that we could look at a map and everyone could look at their home and figure out if they were in a highly polluted place, and it helped to engage people and it helped to drive a conversation. But clearly that statutory connection and use of the map was what was really the thing that was essential to change broadly in public policy. And throughout that process, the coalition, Front and Center coalition partner groups, community members have been involved in every aspect of what you all accomplished. Can you talk about some of the poignant ways or places or times that your members or partners really helped to shape what you were doing?
Yeah, in many ways, the HEAL Act started even before Front and Centered in terms of the ethos of developing a state environmental justice policy. I just want to acknowledge the folks that existed and have been working on that, creating an environmental justice body for the state, and had not been able to get it finished. But there's a long history of work, and particularly work by communities of color on environmental justice in Washington. So we're, fortunate to be working on the heels of that and some advocates within state government, within community on this work. And, the map, as you mentioned, was a good catalyst. It also created an opportunity for us as a Front-Centered coalition to go out to community to talk about environmental justice. So, the process in terms of shaping the map also helped shape the policy. We held listening sessions across the state to help inform and identify, what are the key factors you would want going in to indicate risk to your community. We held kind of joint academic and community symposium to develop that question. We worked heavily on a ballot initiative 1631, that was focused on climate and generating investments to stimulate a just transition. And a part of that policy development for that ballot initiative, we had a very intensive group of community leaders who helped really answer every single question within that ballot measure that we then leveraged that learning into the HEAL Act in terms of creating, ideas like the Environmental Justice Council and how a community leadership body could help provide accountability to state agencies on things like investing climate revenues. So it was really kind of a continuum of community listening, engagement, and organizing that helped shape the policy and then ultimately lead to its passion in terms of mobilizing community.
Well, that's helpful for, I think, our listeners to understand. Front and center's work was to really bring many groups together, groups that have a long, rich history of leading on environmental justice, along with other BIPOC-led organizations that were new to climate, and being able to bring together their collective interests and collective power to be able to make all this happen and to be able to do the engagement work that is required to really design effective policy. And I think seeing how all those pieces came together, and as you acknowledge in particular, the historic leadership that comes from the EJ leaders that are there in Washington State. So since the bill's passed, how are things going? What are some of the challenges that you're seeing in the implementation of the HEAL Act?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that community members will be providing the state with recommendations on climate policy and budget decisions. And the reason why it sits at the recommendation level is because the state itself was opposing some of the ideas that we were trying to push along with the HEAL Act, which was giving community members the decision-making power on certain projects that we were seeing as economic and environmental injustices. We didn't want those projects to continue, but that was the first thing to go in negotiations with the state and with stakeholders. Was we can't give community members this sort of authority to make these decisions. We can't tie the hands of state agencies to this community group. So throughout the whole process, that was something that was discussed and debated and amended throughout the legislative process, was what kind of power can community members actually hold in the HEAL Act. And second to that, for sort of similar reasons, some members of the business community didn't want to see an environmental justice assessment on projects because they believed that it had authority to change the permitting process, whether or not a certain project was able to be carried forward. And for the business community, they have a lot of different interests, right? They represent a multitude of clients that do projects, capital projects, infrastructure projects across the state. And those have different repercussions for communities. Whether you're thinking about a new warehouse that is going to be built in your community or a new facility that is going to be processing material that could lead to even more pollution in the community, all of those are represented by the business community. And working with them throughout the stakeholdering process, and they had given some ideas that the state did adopt. And that happened throughout the whole legislative process, where stakeholders who maybe thought that environmental justice might have gotten in the way of certain projects or was changing the landscape for business community, for housing. All of these really came out of the woodwork and showed up either in opposition to the bill or coming out neutral, or coming out pro. Ultimately, we were successful, and that was because the state, I think, realized we've done the work to stakeholder this bill. We've done the task force to come up with recommendations, which is what the state usually likes to see in bills like this. And community advocates were really holding their feet to the fire when it comes to racial and social justice, because we were also coming off the heels of a huge social movement coming out of the George Floyd murder, right? It was, how are we centering racial and social justice in all of our policies? And the environmental aspect was a huge component of that.
I think we've seen, some substantial investments. Part of the thinking in the legislative process is like, maybe we can get a policy passed, but if there's no investment behind it, we're probably not going to see a lot of action. There were, $12 million dedicated to state agencies in the first 2-year budget coming out of its passage. And we had to come back and fight for $500,000 for community investment to be able to participate in the implementation of HEAL. We saw that reinvestment in this last budget just passed, with a substantial increase in community investment of $26 million between communities and tribes to build capacity to participate in the implementation of environmental justice at state agencies. So that's significant. And, with that money, the state has certainly staffed up environmental justice roles within their agencies. These are advocates that are working within the agencies to help educate about the HEAL obligations to, diverse staff that maybe don't want to talk about it. Maybe some do. So there's a lot of change management and institutional work to be done there. And they have to kind of fulfill these obligations, which are clear and coming on a fairly rapid timeline of developing engagement plans, EJ implementation plan, and coming up now in July, these environmental justice assessments and revised budgeting process. Those actual mandates have been slowly coming along. I think the agencies have felt a bit overwhelmed with that, have not been as deep as we'd like them to be, but I think there's a starting point, and the work can only improve as the capacity builds up, both with the state and in the community, to hold the agencies accountable. So they certainly report to us, a lot of significant change institutionally within the agencies that are happening, but a lot of it still is not yet transparent to community.
And then to add to that, there's a huge cultural component to this, which is kind of what we're starting on today, was how is environmental justice being talked about in the state? And now that we have a definition for our environmental justice and certain mandates that are long-term for state agencies and for the legislature to meet, we're seeing a lot more recognition for environmental justice in most of the climate policy that we're now speaking to. Is how is this affecting overburdened communities? What is our ultimate goal for reducing those health disparities in communities that we know are ranked pretty high in our environmental health disparities map? And so that, I think, can't really be measured, but you're seeing it in debate, and you're seeing environmental justice, as Deric mentioned, multiple times now in the Code of Washington because of the HEAL Act, because community members are asking questions about how is this climate policy that you're pushing, how is it centering environmental justice, how is it centering racial and social justice, which for us is a huge victory. It's now we don't have to start from ground zero in terms of educating members about environmental justice, but now the work kind of begins on getting them deeper, getting more deep into what environmental justice means, so that before they're proposing legislation, before agencies are working on specific initiatives, we don't have to do the legwork of educating them on environmental justice. They know now that it's state law.
It's very exciting to see that the conversation's growing, and I think becoming more politically sophisticated, candidly, as you all have been doing the work that you're doing. We're seeing the same thing federally as President Biden is making huge strides and commitments to environmental justice, his executive orders, other actions that are happening at the federal level. So what's the connection between the HEAL Act and some of the things that you're seeing at the federal level? I mean, Deric, can you help us draw some connections there?
Yeah, I mean, we were pleased to see significant alignment in spirit and in policy of President Biden's executive order with the HEAL Act in terms of identifying agencies requiring environmental justice analysis, providing some transparency on where agencies are at in their implementation of environmental justice. Obviously, the Justice 40 order that preceded it on investments. So that was exciting to see. I think there's some ways that President's executive order goes further in terms of in all of state government. We're still limited in the number of agencies in Washington state. There are ways that, HEAL Act goes further in terms of the type of analysis that's required. But overall, I think there's a good kind of alignment in this general field of how do we push government to do better? How do we get the data that we need? How do we see the actions that result from that data? I think some of the lessons we've learned in Washington is that, just because it's written in an order or a law does not mean the practice is going to immediately follow. There's a huge amount of cultural change and education that's needed within the massive bureaucracies that exist to get government staff to be able to think through an environmental justice lens. That may not come naturally. There may be opposition. So a lot of things to work through. The scorecard aspect of the executive order will need to go into much more depth to actually see if there's real effective change happening versus the status quo. So there's a lot of potential work to do to follow through on that. And it's really, at the end of the day, it's all about the follow through. We need that leadership from the top, which, we have in Washington and now the federal government, but it's going to take a huge lift to actually make it meaningful for the people who are experiencing environmental racism.
And do you see a benefit to having federal policy and state policy in this regard, how those things work together?
I think, well, we certainly need the federal policy to address the federal agency actions. It's been interesting to see how folks in state government have kind of traded off federal and state, at times optimistically to kind of one, manage their workload, which is understandable, but our approach is to look and set a high bar. So if the federal government's going higher on transparency, we can push our state government. One of the things we've run into Washington is it's a very decentralized implementation of the law. So each agency, they're trying to work together, but there's no clear leadership and direction. The federal law looks to set up at least a more clear leadership structure to drive agency action and hold them accountable from inside. And, our work is on the outside. So I think we continue to look for the high bar and push on that. We're going to do that within the state agencies here in Washington as well, is to show kind of the best practices.
I think this point too of the states having the capacity to set that really high bar, I think for Washington state as an innovator state that's really leading on policy models and ideas. And then at the same time, I think President Biden is doing that as well. The EJ office in the White House, you don't have anything like that in the governor's office. Just different things that we can be learning from different national and state leaders who are really making a commitment and trying to figure out how to do these things. But obviously, lots of lessons to learn, lots of work yet to happen to really get us to where we need to be, given the history of neglect and disregard, and we would argue, right, active harm to communities, frontline BIPOC communities, and to the extent that the reparations that we want to make as well, and also tribal nations. So it's great to be able to have this conversation and excited to see where you all go next and what the next great idea is, Deric, that you come up with. And Guillermo, just so appreciate the hard work that it takes to work in state legislatures and to be able to convince policymakers that they have a vested interest to represent their constituency and that the people of the state are not a special interest group like corporations and others, but really are the people of the state. And all that you all are doing is trying to help them be more representative and to be able to do a better job. And so I appreciate that you are there in the trenches trying to remind them of their responsibility. So we ask all of our guests as we end our podcast on a positive note about what makes you hopeful about the environmental justice movement. So Deric, what's making you optimistic these days?
Well, I think it's, as we've talked about the conversation and the level of attention to environmental justice is just exploded really. And the learning is a little bit slow to catch up in terms of like what that looks like in implementation. But the opportunity is really there to shape both policy and investments. And, we're doing as much as we can to fill those opportunities, with the community leaders that are ready to kind of share what they need and their solutions. But the breadth of opportunity is really just immense. And we just need to make sure it's accountable.
We should do a whole nother show about capacity needs. I can only imagine how many requests that you both are feeling and receiving, as well as the leaders on the ground and in communities, just the requests now that we recognize that their expertise is so important to solving the climate crisis. Guillermo, what about you? What makes you hopeful these days?
I think for me, coming from the legislative standpoint, is seeing our community members. We're growing. We have 70 at the moment, but our community-based organizations are taking up more of a role in the environmental justice movement. A lot of them are working on either farm worker policy, on housing, or on different racial and social justice issues. And they're growing their capacity to address environmental justice and the climate crisis. I was just talking to a labor union last week, and they were saying that their labor union had identified the climate crisis and environmental justice as their top issue. And to see that, it's great from a legislative standpoint, but I think it also speaks to the urgency of the climate crisis. Is folks are feeling the very real effects of extreme heat or extreme cold, and knowing that maybe their houses are not equipped to handle a lot of these extreme weather events. But now there is growing revenue to address those. So I think it's our community members that are trying to say, hey, this money is supposed to go to communities like ours. This is what we need these kinds of projects for. And, we need a role in decision making. So I think for me, it's community members taking a more active role in the environmental justice and climate crisis movement.
Thank you, Guillermo and Deric, for being with us today. And thanks to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. Special thanks to our producer, Taylor Ward, and our recording engineer and editor, Angel Batista. If you'd like to know more about our work at Just Solutions, visit our website at justsolutionscollective.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest updates. Together, we are driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for our next episode.